I'm Anna Steinberg, 32, and I built my life on discipline and service, quiet wins, steady work, no shortcuts. For years, I carried a marriage, moved when orders changed, fixed the fallout, protected his image. Then outside the base, he spat on me and shouted, "You're nothing without me." In that moment, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been undermined or humiliated by someone you poured your best into? Share it in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I learned discipline before I learned to tie my shoes. My father was career Navy, and our house ran like a ship, everything in its place, everyone pulling their weight. Mom never complained about the deployments or the sudden moves. She just packed us up and made wherever we landed feel like home. That's what military families do, she'd say. We adapt, we support, we serve something bigger than ourselves. By the time I was 18, those values weren't just lessons, they were bone deep. Loyalty wasn't a choice, it was who I was. When other kids partied through college, I worked 2 jobs and kept my grades up. When friends complained about responsibility, I volunteered for it. I believed that if you committed to something, you saw it through. If you gave your word, you kept it. If someone needed your support, you provided it without keeping score. That's probably why I fell so hard for Brian the night I met him at that off-base bar in Virginia Beach. He was everything I thought I wanted, tall, confident, with that easy smile that made everyone in the room turn to look. He wore his uniform like it was tailored for him, and when he talked about his career plans, his eyes lit up with genuine ambition. Here was someone who understood service, who shared my values, who wanted to build something meaningful. "I'm going to make Colonel before I'm 40, he told me on our 3rd date, his hand warm over mine across the restaurant table. Maybe General if I play my cards right. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who gets it, you know? Someone who understands what it takes." I understood perfectly. I'd grown up watching my mother be that someone for my father, the steady force behind his success, the one who managed everything else so he could focus on his mission. It seemed natural, even noble. When Brian talked about our future together, I could see it clearly. The 2 of us building his career, me providing the foundation that would let him soar. The early years felt like proof that we were meant for this. I handled our finances because he was always deploying or training. I managed our social calendar because his schedule was unpredictable. When he came home stressed from exercises or frustrated with his commanding officers, I listened. When he made mistakes, forgot to submit paperwork, missed important deadlines, rubbed someone the wrong way, I helped him figure out how to fix it. "Thank God for you," he'd say, pulling me close after I'd spent hours helping him prepare for a review board or researching regulations he should have known. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I took those words as love. They felt like partnership, like we were building something together. When his first promotion came through, we celebrated like it was ours. When he got orders to a better assignment, I quit my job and followed without hesitation. This was what military wives did. This was what love looked like. But somewhere along the way, the partnership started feeling one-sided. Brian began assuming I'd handle things rather than asking. The thank yous became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. When friends complimented him on his success or his organization, he accepted the praise without mentioning my contributions. When his family visited, they talked about his achievements as if they'd happened in a vacuum. "Brian is so disciplined," his mother would say, surveying our perfectly maintained home. "Such attention to detail. No wonder he's doing so well." I'd smile and pour more coffee, pretending not to notice that Brian never corrected the assumption. He let them believe he was the one who remembered birthdays, who kept track of bills, who maintained the relationships that smoothed his path through the military's social hierarchy. I told myself it didn't matter. Results mattered. Our shared goals mattered. His success was my success, and keeping score was petty. The moves got easier because I'd perfected the system, researching new duty stations, finding housing, managing the logistics of our life while he focused on his career. The social events became routine because I'd learned exactly how to present us as the perfect military couple. I could network with other wives, charm his superiors at dinner parties, and deflect attention from his occasional lapses in judgment or protocol. I became so good at managing his image that I sometimes forgot where his reputation ended and my work began. When colleagues praised his attention to detail, I felt proud. When commanders noted his stellar record, I felt vindicated. This was what we'd built together, even if no one else could see my fingerprints on it. But fingerprints fade when no one acknowledges they exist. Slowly, quietly, Brian began rewriting our story. In his version, he was the architect of his own success. I was the supportive wife, grateful to be along for the ride. When people asked how he managed to balance such a demanding career with such a well-run personal life, he'd flash that same smile that had drawn me in years earlier. Good time management, he'd say. And luck, I guess. Some things just fall into place. I started noticing the small betrayals first, how he'd claim credit for ideas I'd suggested, how he'd tell stories about problems he'd solved without mentioning that I'd done the research or made the calls. How he'd accept compliments for our home's appearance, our social connections, our financial stability as if they were natural extensions of his own competence rather than the result of my careful, constant work. Still, I told myself it was normal. Marriage required sacrifice, compromise, teamwork. Maybe I was being sensitive, keeping score when I should be celebrating our shared achievements. Maybe this was just how strong partnerships worked, one person in the spotlight, the other providing the foundation. My father had been the face of our family's military service, but my mother's contributions had been just as vital, even if they went unrecognized. I kept adapting, kept supporting, kept serving something I believed was bigger than myself. I didn't realize how much I'd shrunk in the process, or how far we'd drifted from the partnership I thought we were building. I didn't see that Brian had stopped seeing me as his equal somewhere along the way, or that his family and friends were starting to see me the same way he did, as a convenient accessory to his success rather than a person with my own worth. The signs were there, subtle but unmistakable. I just chose not to read them yet. Those small betrayals started adding up like compound interest, growing into something harder to ignore. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a shift in tone, a change in the way Brian spoke to me when we weren't in public. The warm gratitude I'd come to expect after I'd helped him through a crisis became perfunctory, then disappeared altogether. The way he introduced me at events changed from my wife, who keeps me organized, to just my wife, then sometimes to nothing at all. Can you believe Sarah thinks she deserves credit for Tom's promotion? His sister said during one family dinner, talking about another couple we knew. I mean, she didn't do anything except be married to him. Brian laughed, agreeing readily. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized he saw no irony in the comment, no connection to our own situation. When I caught his eye across the table, hoping for some acknowledgement of my contributions to his career, he just smiled blandly and changed the subject. The joke started around that time, little comments about my dependence, my limited understanding of his real work, my simple role in his more complex life. Always delivered with a smile, always in front of others, always positioned as harmless teasing between spouses. But they stung, particularly because they inverted the truth so completely. She has no idea what I actually do all day, he'd say when friends asked about his job, as if I hadn't spent countless hours researching military regulations, helping him prepare for evaluations, and coaching him through interpersonal conflicts with his chain of command. Bless her heart, she thinks it's all parades and ceremony. His friends would chuckle knowingly, and I'd force a smile, playing the role of the naive military wife who didn't understand her husband's important, complicated work. It was easier than correcting the record and revealing how much of his success I'd actually engineered behind the scenes. Brian began assuming my support was automatic, like a utility he'd forgotten he was paying for. He'd hand me problems to solve without discussion, scheduling conflicts, social obligations, financial decisions, then present the solutions as his own work. When his commanding officer complimented him on his thorough preparation for a review board, Brian accepted the praise without mentioning the 10 hours I'd spent helping him organize his records and practice his presentation. Natural talent, he said, shrugging modestly. Some people just have it. I started feeling invisible in my own life, like a stage manager watching actors take credit for a production I'd choreographed. The people who praised Brian's discipline had never seen me up at dawn, organizing his schedule and preparing his uniforms. The colleagues who admired his attention to detail didn't know I was the one who double-checked his paperwork and reminded him of important deadlines. The family members who celebrated his financial responsibility had no idea I was the one actually managing our money. But the worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was watching Brian start to believe his own revised history. He began acting as if his success had always been inevitable, as if the careful support system I'd built around him was just the natural order of things. When younger soldiers asked for career advice, he'd share wisdom that was actually mine, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd learned it through personal experience rather than late-night conversations with his wife. The key is staying organized, he'd tell them, having never organized anything more complex than his own sock drawer. And building good relationships. People remember who they can count on. The irony was devastating, but I kept quiet. Making a scene, demanding credit, correcting the record, all of that felt petty, undignified, destructive to what we were building together. I told myself that results mattered more than recognition, that our shared success was worth more than my individual pride. His family reinforced this dynamic every chance they got, treating me with the kind of condescending affection usually reserved for pets or small children. They'd praise my cooking, my housekeeping, my ability to keep Brian happy, as if happiness was a service I provided rather than something we created together. When Brian received awards or commendations, they'd congratulate him as if he'd achieved success in spite of marriage rather than because of it. "You're so lucky to have someone who understands your potential," his mother would tell him, patting his hand across the dinner table. Not everyone finds a woman who's content to just be supportive. Content. As if my ambitions had simply evaporated, as if I'd chosen limitation over achievement, as if supporting his dreams meant I'd never had any of my own. I'd given up career opportunities, geographic preferences, personal goals, and social connections to build his success, but his family saw it as natural female sacrifice rather than strategic partnership. Brian never corrected these characterizations. If anything, he seemed to encourage them, basking in the image of himself as the naturally gifted leader who'd married a woman wise enough to recognize his superiority. The man who'd once needed my help preparing for basic performance reviews now acted as if guidance was something he provided rather than received. The power dynamic had shifted so gradually I almost missed it, like a tide that changes everything while you're not paying attention. But by then, the imbalance was unmistakable, and I was starting to realize that my loyalty might not be as valued as I'd believed. The final humiliation came on a Tuesday morning in March, outside the main gate of Norfolk Naval Base. I'd driven Brian to work because his car was in the shop, another small service I'd provided without thinking twice. We'd been arguing during the drive about something trivial, a disagreement about weekend plans that had escalated because we were both tense about his upcoming performance review. "Just drop me here," he said as we approached the gate, his voice tight with frustration. I pulled over, expecting the usual quick goodbye, maybe an apology for the argument. Instead, Brian got out of the car, slammed the door, then turned back to face me through the open window. His expression was ugly with contempt, transformed by a rage that seemed wildly disproportionate to our minor disagreement. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising. "I'm sick of this. Sick of your attitude, sick of your constant questions, sick of pretending you have any idea what my life is actually like." Other people were starting to stare, service members heading to work, families dropping off their spouses, the usual morning crowd. I felt my face flush with embarrassment, but I kept my voice low, hoping to defuse the situation. "Brian, please. People are watching." That seemed to enrage him further. He stepped closer to the car, his face contorted with a fury I'd never seen before, and spat directly at me through the window. The saliva hit my cheek and dripped down onto my shirt, warm and shocking. "You're nothing without me," he shouted, loud enough for everyone within 50 yards to hear. "Nothing. You think you're so smart, so important, but you're just my wife. That's all you are, that's all you've ever been, and that's all you'll ever be." His family had gathered nearby, his brother worked on base, and his parents were visiting that week. Instead of being appalled by his behavior, they stood there nodding, some of them actually smiling with approval. His mother crossed her arms and looked at me with satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting years for Brian to finally put me in my place. "It's about time," his sister said, loud enough for me to hear. "She's been getting too big for her britches." The humiliation was complete, public, and deliberate. Brian had chosen to strip away my dignity in front of a community that knew us both, in front of his family, who clearly supported his cruelty, in front of strangers who would remember the scene long after they forgot our names. He'd reduced 10 years of marriage, partnership, and support to that single phrase, "You're nothing without me." I sat in the driver's seat with spit drying on my face, my hands trembling with shock and rage, watching my husband walk toward the gate with his head held high. His family dispersed, chattering excitedly among themselves as if they'd just witnessed some kind of victory. The morning crowd resumed their routines, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my marriage and my reputation. I drove home in silence, my mind strangely blank. I cleaned the spit off my face and changed my shirt, moving through these actions mechanically, as if they were items on a checklist. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment outside the base. The partnership I'd believed in, the love I'd trusted, the future I'd been building, all of it had been revealed as illusion. Brian had shown me exactly how he saw me, exactly how little he valued everything I'd given him. And for the first time in 10 years, I began to wonder what I might be without him. The first thing I did when I got home was cancel my appointments for the day. I told everyone I had a stomach bug, a small lie that felt appropriate, given how nauseous the morning had left me. Then I sat in our kitchen, staring at the coffee mug Brian had left on the counter, and tried to process what had just happened. The spit had been shocking, but it wasn't really about the spit. It was about the years of accumulated disrespect, the gradual erosion of partnership, the slow transformation from valued teammate to convenient accessory. The public humiliation had just made it impossible to ignore anymore. I found myself reviewing our marriage like evidence in a case I was building against myself. Had I been too accommodating? Too willing to fade into the background? Too eager to enable his success at the expense of my own identity? The questions felt dangerous, like picking at a wound that might never heal properly if I kept disturbing it. But I couldn't stop. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my pride to maintain peace. All the credit I'd let him take, all the work I'd done invisibly, all the dreams I deferred to support his ambitions. I thought about his family's satisfied expressions as he degraded me, as if they'd been waiting for this moment for years. My friend Janet called around noon to check on me. We'd met through the Officers' Wives Club, and she was one of the few military spouses I knew who'd maintained her own career throughout her marriage. She'd always seemed more independent than the rest of us, less willing to disappear into her husband's identity. "You sound terrible," she said when I answered the phone. "What's wrong?" I found myself telling her everything: the argument, the scene at the base, Brian's words, his family's reaction. As I talked, I realized I was crying, something I hadn't done in years. Janet listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage at all the right moments. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished. "I'm so sorry." "That's absolutely unacceptable behavior. You know that, right?" Did I know that? I'd been married to a military officer for so long that I'd absorbed some of the culture's complicated attitudes about hierarchy and submission. I'd internalized the idea that supporting your spouse's career was the highest form of love, that sacrifice was noble, that partnership sometimes meant one person's needs taking precedence over the others. "I keep thinking maybe I provoked it somehow," I said. "Maybe I was being too critical, too demanding. Maybe he was just stressed about work." "Stop," Janet said firmly. "There is no excuse for what he did to you. None. Stress doesn't make you spit on your wife in public. Stress doesn't make you humiliate the person who's been supporting your career for a decade." She was quiet for a moment, then continued more gently. "Can I tell you something? Bill and I went through a rough patch a few years ago. He was getting passed over for promotions, feeling like his career was stalling. He started taking it out on me, making little comments about my work, acting like my job was a hobby compared to his real career. I'd never heard Janet talk about marital problems before. Most military wives I knew maintained a facade of perfect partnership, as if admitting difficulties might somehow damage their husbands' careers. "What did you do?" I asked. "I reminded him that we were supposed to be on the same team," she said. "And when that didn't work, I reminded him that I was perfectly capable of succeeding without him, but he'd never succeeded without me." That got his attention. The conversation stayed with me for the rest of the day. As I moved through our house, cleaning, organizing, maintaining the domestic perfection that supported Brian's image, I started seeing everything differently. The spotless kitchen that impressed his colleagues at dinner parties. The carefully managed social calendar that kept us connected to the right people. The financial stability that let him take professional risks without worrying about consequences. How much of Brian's success was actually mine? How much of his reputation was built on work I'd done invisibly? How much of his career had been possible only because I'd handled everything else? By evening, I'd reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and liberating. I wasn't nothing without Brian. Brian might be nothing without me. When he came home that night, he acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek, asked about dinner, complained about his day. The casual normalcy felt like another slap in the face. Did he think I'd simply absorb this morning's humiliation and move on? Did he think so little of me that he expected no consequences for his behavior? "How was your day?" he asked, settling into his chair with a beer. "Fine," I said, my voice steady. "How was yours?" "Busy." The new XO is micromanaging everything. I swear, some people get a little authority and completely lose perspective. The irony was breathtaking, but I just nodded and served dinner. As we ate, Brian talked about his work, his colleagues, his frustrations with military bureaucracy. He didn't apologize for the morning. He didn't acknowledge what he'd done. He acted as if his behavior had been reasonable, justified, maybe even overdue. That night, lying in bed beside my husband, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. But for the first time in years, I also felt something like clarity. Brian had freed me from any illusion about what our marriage really was. He'd shown me exactly how he valued my contributions, exactly how much respect he had for my dignity, exactly what he thought our partnership was worth. In spitting on me, he'd also released me from any obligation to protect him from the consequences of his choices. I no longer owed him my loyalty, my support, or my silence. For the first time in our marriage, I was free to act in my own interests rather than his. The question was, what did I want to do with that freedom? The decision came to me over the course of the next few days, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a gradual crystallization of resolve. I spent those days functioning normally, cooking, cleaning, maintaining our social schedule, but underneath the routine, I was calculating. I was remembering. I was preparing. Brian seemed to think the matter was closed. He'd asserted his dominance, put me in my place, and now we could return to normal. He was cheerful at breakfast, affectionate in the evenings, confident in his dealings with colleagues and friends. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than he'd been in months, as if the confrontation had relieved some internal pressure. But I was remembering things. I was remembering the incident 2 years ago when Brian had failed to submit a required report on time, and how I'd spent a weekend researching regulations and precedents to help him craft an explanation that wouldn't damage his record. I was remembering the commanding officer's wife who'd disliked Brian for unclear reasons, and how I'd spent months cultivating a friendship with her, slowly changing her opinion through careful social maneuvering. I was remembering the financial mistakes Brian had made early in our marriage, the credit problems, the missed payments, the poor investment decisions, and how I'd spent years quietly fixing his credit and building our financial stability. I was remembering all the times I'd smoothed over his social missteps, deflected criticism, or provided information and insights that had helped him navigate military politics. Most importantly, I was remembering the conversation I'd overheard 6 months earlier, when Brian's current commanding officer had been discussing personnel decisions with another senior officer at a dinner party. They'd been standing near the kitchen, talking quietly, but I'd heard every word. Brian is solid, the CO had said. Good officer, reliable, detail-oriented. But he's got some blind spots. Nothing major, but he tends to miss interpersonal dynamics, doesn't always read situations correctly. He's lucky to have such a sharp wife. She's been invaluable in helping him navigate some tricky situations. At the time, I'd felt proud hearing that recognition, even secondhand. Now, I realized it was valuable intelligence. Brian's commanding officer knew exactly how much I contributed to his success. More importantly, he'd be interested in knowing about any behavior that might reflect poorly on Brian's character or judgment. I'd also been thinking about the security clearance renewal process Brian was going through. It was routine, something that happened every 5 years for officers at his level, but it involved extensive background checks, interviews with family members and colleagues, and a thorough review of personal conduct. Questions about domestic violence, financial problems, or behavior that might make someone vulnerable to blackmail or coercion. The timing was perfect. The investigation was already underway, which meant investigators were already asking questions about Brian's character and conduct. All I had to do was make sure they had complete information to work with. On Friday morning, I made a series of phone calls. First to Janet, asking for the name of her lawyer, not for divorce proceedings, I explained, just for some general advice about my rights and options. Then to the base's Family Readiness Group coordinator, asking about resources for military spouses dealing with domestic issues. Finally, to the Security Clearance Investigation Office, asking to schedule an interview to supplement my husband's background check. I want to make sure you have all the relevant information, I told the investigator who called me back. There have been some incidents lately that might be relevant to his clearance determination. The investigator was polite, professional, interested. We scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday. I would tell him about Brian's behavior at the base, about his family's reaction, about the pattern of disrespect and entitlement I'd observed. I would provide context about our financial situation, about the support I'd provided for his career, about his tendency to take credit for work he hadn't done. I wouldn't exaggerate or lie. I would simply tell the truth, completely and without the protective editing I'd been doing for years. I would let the investigator draw his own conclusions about whether this information raised concerns about Brian's character, judgment, or reliability. That evening, Brian came home excited about something that had happened at work. His commanding officer had complimented him on his preparation for an upcoming inspection, noting his attention to detail and thorough understanding of complex regulations. He said I was exactly the kind of officer the Navy needs more of, Brian told me proudly. Disciplined, knowledgeable, reliable. He's recommending me for early promotion consideration. I smiled and congratulated him, then excused myself to finish dinner preparations. As I worked in the kitchen, I thought about Tuesday's appointment, about the investigator's questions, about the conversation that would determine whether Brian's security clearance would be renewed. For the first time since that morning at the base, I felt something like peace. Not happiness. This wasn't about happiness. But satisfaction, maybe. The satisfaction of knowing that actions have consequences, that choices matter, that respect isn't optional in a marriage. Brian had shown me exactly who he was and exactly what he thought of me. Now I was going to show him exactly what I was capable of when I stopped protecting him from himself. Tuesday morning came sooner than I'd expected, but I was ready. I'd spent the weekend organizing my thoughts, gathering documents, and preparing for questions I knew the investigator would ask. I dressed carefully, professional but not formal, approachable but serious, and drove to the appointment with steady hands and clear purpose. The investigator was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Chin, with kind eyes and a manner that put me immediately at ease. Her office was small and cluttered with case files, but she'd arranged 2 comfortable chairs facing each other and had coffee waiting when I arrived. "Thank you for reaching out to us," she said as we settled into our chairs. It's not uncommon for family members to have additional information that helps us get a complete picture of a candidate's background and character. Why don't you start by telling me about your concerns? I began with the incident at the base, describing it factually and without editorial comment. Patricia took notes, asking occasional questions for clarification, but mostly just listening. When I finished describing that morning, she looked up from her notepad. "That must have been very difficult for you," she said. "How long would you say this kind of behavior has been going on?" That question opened a door I'd been waiting years to walk through. I told her about the gradual shift in our marriage, about Brian's increasing tendency to take credit for work I'd done, about his family's attitudes toward me, about the pattern of disrespect that had culminated in that public humiliation. I showed her documents I'd brought, financial records, correspondence, examples of work I'd done to support his career. "I want to be clear," I said at one point. "I'm not trying to sabotage my husband's career. But I think you should know who he really is when he's not performing for his superiors. I think you should understand how he treats the person who's supported him most consistently over the years." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "These kinds of character issues are exactly what we're looking for in these investigations. Someone's behavior toward their spouse and family often reflects their fundamental values and judgment. How they handle power, how they treat people who can't retaliate, whether they're honest about their own limitations." We talked for 2 hours. Patricia asked about Brian's financial decisions, his relationships with colleagues, his handling of stress and setbacks. I answered every question honestly, providing context I'd never shared before, describing patterns I'd been too loyal to acknowledge previously. "Is there anything else you think we should know?" Patricia asked as our meeting wound down. I thought about that question carefully. There was one more thing, something I discovered completely by accident the previous week while organizing Brian's desk. A letter from his commanding officer, marked confidential, outlining concerns about Brian's performance on a recent training exercise. The letter mentioned poor judgment, inadequate preparation, and leadership failures that had compromised his unit's effectiveness. Brian had never mentioned this letter to me, never asked for my help in addressing the concerns it raised. He'd simply hidden it away and continued acting as if his career was progressing smoothly. But if he was being considered for early promotion, his superiors deserved to know that his own commanding officer had serious reservations about his capabilities. I mentioned the letter, describing where I'd found it and what it contained. Patricia made additional notes, thanked me for my thoroughness, and assured me that all information would be handled confidentially. "The investigation process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks, she said as I prepared to leave. "Your husband will be notified of the decision through his chain of command. Is there anything else you need from us? Resources, support services, referrals?" I thanked her but said I had everything I needed. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd betrayed my husband, I'd simply told the truth. Not because I was seeking revenge, I was seeking accountability. I'd spent a decade protecting Brian from the consequences of his choices, managing his reputation, covering his mistakes. Now, for the first time, he would face judgment based on who he actually was rather than the image I'd helped him create. The next 3 weeks passed normally on the surface. Brian continued his routine, confident in his career trajectory and secure in his assumption that I'd absorbed his cruelty without consequence. He mentioned the background check investigation occasionally, always in the context of routine procedures that would confirm his suitability for continued clearance. "Just a formality," he'd say dismissively. "They have to go through the motions, interview family members, check references. It's actually kind of flattering that they're being so thorough. Shows how serious they are about my promotion potential." I nodded and smiled, maintaining the supportive facade that had defined our marriage for so many years. But underneath, I was waiting. I was watching. I was preparing for the moment when Brian would discover that choices have weight, that respect isn't optional, that the person he'd dismissed as nothing might be more substantial than he'd realized. That moment came on a Thursday evening in April, 3 weeks and 2 days after my meeting with Patricia Chin. The call came at 7:47 p.m., just as we were finishing dinner. Brian answered with his usual confident tone, expecting routine communication from his command. I watched his face change as he listened, saw the color drain from his cheeks, watched his confident expression transform into confusion, then shock, then something approaching panic. "I don't understand," he said into the phone. "There must be some mistake. Can you explain what specific concerns?" "Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I understand. Tomorrow morning at 0800. "Yes, sir." He hung up and sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with better news. When he finally looked at me, his face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly. "My security clearance has been revoked," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Effective immediately. I'm being called in tomorrow morning to meet with the commanding officer and the security manager. They said there were significant character and judgment concerns raised during the background investigation." I felt my heart racing, but I kept my expression neutral, concerned but not surprised. "What kind of concerns? Did they give you any details?" "No details. Just that the decision was final and that I needed to report tomorrow morning to discuss next steps." He looked at me with genuine confusion. "I don't understand how this happened. The investigation was supposed to be routine. I haven't done anything wrong." That night, Brian made 49 phone calls. I listened from the bedroom as he contacted friends, colleagues, mentors, anyone who might have influence or information about what had gone wrong. He called his father, his brother, his former commanding officers. He called the security office, the personnel department, the base legal office. No one had answers. No one could help. No one could explain how a routine security clearance renewal had turned into a career-ending catastrophe. Around 3 a.m., I heard him in his office, going through files, looking for something that might explain this disaster. I heard him pull out the confidential letter I'd mentioned to Patricia Chin, the one documenting his performance failures, the one he'd hidden from me for weeks. I heard him curse softly as he realized that investigators might have found it, might have used it as evidence of his dishonesty or poor judgment. But he still hadn't connected my name to his downfall. He still saw me as his ally, his supporter, the person who would stand by him as he fought to salvage his career. When he came to bed just before dawn, exhausted and defeated, he reached for me with the assumption that I would comfort him, that I would help him figure out what had gone wrong. "I'm sorry I woke you," he whispered. "I just can't understand how this happened. Everything was going so well." I held him as he fell asleep, this man who'd spat on me 7 weeks earlier, who'd called me nothing in front of his family, who'd spent years taking credit for my work and dismissing my contributions. I held him and felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in phone calls at dinner time, in meetings with commanding officers, in signatures on documents that change everything. Sometimes it's delivered by the very people you thought you could treat with impunity, by the partners you assumed would always absorb your cruelty without consequence. Brian would spend the next few months trying to understand what had destroyed his career, trying to appeal decisions that couldn't be appealed, trying to rebuild a reputation that had been exposed as artificial. He would eventually realize that his success had been built on foundations I'd provided, foundations that crumbled when I stopped maintaining them. But that morning, watching him sleep fitfully beside me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The peace that comes from knowing you've finally stopped accepting less than you deserve. The satisfaction of watching choices generate appropriate consequences. And the quiet strength that comes from discovering you were never nothing at all. In the weeks that followed Brian's career collapse, something unexpected happened. Instead of falling apart, I began to thrive. Without the constant emotional labor of managing his image and ego, I had energy for my own interests. Without the need to remain invisible so he could shine, I discovered I had opinions, ambitions, and capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. The base community's reaction was swift and predictable. Military society is small and gossip travels fast, especially when it involves someone's security clearance being revoked. Within days, everyone knew that Brian's career was over. The whispered conversations stopped when I entered rooms, replaced by awkward silence and averted eyes. But something interesting happened in those first few weeks. People began approaching me differently, as if they were seeing me clearly for the first time. Colonel Peterson, Brian's former commanding officer, made a point of speaking with me at the commissary one morning. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that your husband's situation doesn't reflect on you in any way. In fact, several of us have been impressed by how you've handled this difficult period with such dignity and composure." I thanked him, but his words stayed with me. For the first time, I was being evaluated on my own merits rather than as an extension of Brian's reputation. The revelation was both liberating and unsettling. How long had I been invisible in my own life? At home, Brian was unraveling systematically. Without his security clearance, he couldn't perform his duties. He'd been reassigned to administrative tasks while his appeal worked its way through the system, but we both knew the appeal was a formality. Security clearances aren't revoked lightly, and they're almost never reinstated once character issues have been identified. He spent his days making increasingly desperate phone calls, calling in favors, trying to find someone with enough influence to intervene on his behalf. He'd wake up energized by some new strategy, some contact who might be able to help, only to end the day defeated by another closed door, another polite but firm refusal. There has to be something, he'd say, pacing our living room with manic energy. Someone made a mistake. Someone got bad information. This can't be the end of everything I've worked for. I listened to these monologues with what I hoped looked like supportive concern, but inside I felt detached, analytical. This was what desperation looked like when it belonged to someone who'd never had to face real consequences before. Brian had spent years believing his own mythology, convinced that his success was inevitable, that his talent would always protect him from serious setbacks. The reality was more complex, and I was probably the only person who understood it completely. Brian wasn't incompetent, but he wasn't exceptional either. His career had been built on careful management, strategic relationships, and the kind of behind-the-scenes support that had allowed his modest abilities to look like natural talent. Without that support system, without me, he was revealed as exactly what he was, an average officer with above-average confidence and below-average judgment. 3 weeks after the revocation, Brian received official notice that his appeal had been denied. He came home that evening looking older than I'd ever seen him, carrying the letter like it weighed 50 pounds. "It's over," he said, sinking into his chair. 22 years of service, and it's over. They're offering early retirement, but my pension will be reduced. My reputation is destroyed. No one in the civilian sector will want to hire someone whose security clearance was revoked for character issues. For the first time since this began, he looked directly at me, really looked at me, as if he was seeing me as a separate person rather than an extension of himself. "I don't know what we're going to do," he said. "I don't know how we're going to survive this." The "we" was interesting. For months, Brian had been so focused on his own crisis that he'd barely acknowledged my existence. Now, suddenly, he needed me again. Now, when his career was destroyed and his options were limited, he remembered that marriage was supposed to be a partnership. But I'd been thinking about our future too, and my conclusions were different from his. I'd been meeting with Janet's lawyer, exploring my rights and options. I'd been researching my own career prospects, updating my resume, networking with people who knew me as an individual rather than as Brian's wife. I'd been imagining what my life might look like if I stopped defining myself by his success and started building my own. "I've been thinking about that too," I said carefully. "About what comes next." Brian looked at me expectantly, waiting for reassurance, for a plan, for the kind of problem-solving support I'd been providing for years. Instead, I handed him a manila envelope I'd been carrying around for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. "What's this?" he asked. "Divorce papers," I said. "I filed last week." The silence that followed was profound. Brian stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade, then at me, then back at the papers. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally something approaching recognition. "You're leaving me," he said slowly. "You're leaving me now, when I need you most." "I'm leaving you because of who you are," I corrected. "Not because of what happened to your career. Because of how you've treated me, how you've seen me, how you've valued my contributions to our life together." I thought about that morning at the base, about his spit on my face, about his family cheering as he humiliated me publicly. I thought about years of invisible work, unacknowledged contributions, and gradual erasure of my identity. "You told me I was nothing without you," I said. "You were wrong about that. But it took me a while to figure out what you might be without me." Brian set the papers on the coffee table with shaking hands. When he looked up at me again, his expression had changed. For the first time in years, I saw something that might have been respect in his eyes, or at least recognition. "You did this," he said quietly. "You're the reason my clearance was revoked. You talked to the investigators." I didn't deny it. There was no point in lies now, and I wasn't ashamed of what I'd done. "I told them the truth," I said. "About who you really are when no one important is watching. About how you treat the person who's supported you most consistently over the years." They drew their own conclusions about what that meant for your character and judgment. Brian was quiet for a long time, processing this information. I could see him working backward through recent months, understanding for the first time how his career had been destroyed, recognizing the role I'd played in his downfall. "So this was all revenge," he said finally. "Everything, the divorce, the investigation, the appeals process, you orchestrated all of it because I hurt your feelings." The characterization was typical Brian, reducing complex motivations to simple emotions, framing accountability as vindictiveness. But I didn't feel the need to correct his interpretation. Let him think whatever made this easier for him to accept. "The divorce paperwork includes a proposed settlement," I said instead. "I think you'll find the terms fair, considering everything." Over the next 2 months, Brian tried various strategies to change my mind. First came anger, accusations, threats, demands that I reconsider what I was throwing away. Then bargaining, promises to change, offers to attend counseling, pledges to treat me with more respect in the future. Finally came something that might have been genuine remorse, late-night conversations where he admitted he'd taken me for granted, acknowledged that he'd been unfair, claimed he finally understood what he was losing. But understanding and change are different things, and I'd learned not to confuse Brian's words with his actual character. He was sorry about the consequences of his behavior, not the behavior itself. He was grieving the loss of my support, not regretting how he'd treated me when he'd thought that support was guaranteed. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in August. Brian didn't contest the settlement, partly because he couldn't afford extended legal fees, but mostly because he knew I had information that could make his post-military transition even more difficult. We divided our assets equitably, and I kept the house until it sold. He moved into a small apartment across town and began the process of rebuilding his life, without the career that had defined him for 2 decades. I felt lighter walking out of that courthouse than I had in years. Not vindicated. Vindication implies you've been wronged and then proven right. This felt more like completion, like a long overdue accounting had finally been settled. Brian had shown me who he really was, and I'd responded accordingly. The consequences were proportional to his choices, and I'd finally stopped accepting responsibility for managing those consequences. 6 months later, I ran into his mother at the grocery store. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered, and when she saw me, her face crumpled with something between grief and anger. "You destroyed him," she said, her voice shaking. "He's working at a hardware store now, making $12 an hour. 22 years of service, and he's selling paint and lumber to make ends meet. You destroyed his life because he had one bad day." I thought about responding, about explaining that spitting on your wife in public wasn't one bad day, but the culmination of years of disrespect and entitlement. I thought about describing the pattern of behavior that had led to that moment, about the investigation that had revealed character issues serious enough to revoke a security clearance. Instead, I just nodded sympathetically and moved on. Brian's mother would never understand that choices have consequences, that treating people badly eventually costs more than you expect to pay. She would always see me as the villain in this story, the ungrateful wife who'd abandoned her husband when he needed her most. But I knew the truth was more complex. I hadn't destroyed Brian. I'd simply stopped protecting him from himself. I hadn't been vindictive. I'd been honest about who he was when no one important was watching. I hadn't abandoned him in his time of need. I'd finally acknowledged that my needs mattered too. The woman who'd sat silently while her husband spat on her was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. That transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without cost. But it had happened, and it was irreversible. Walking to my car that day, I thought about the morning that had started all of this, the argument, the spit, the family members cheering as Brian humiliated me publicly. He'd intended to put me in my place, to remind me how dependent I was on his success and status. Instead, he'd freed me from any illusion about what our marriage really was. In trying to make me feel small, he'd helped me remember how substantial I actually was. In telling me I was nothing without him, he'd motivated me to discover exactly what I was capable of on my own. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't taken me 10 years to understand it. But understanding had come, eventually, along with the courage to act on it. And now, finally, I was free to find out who I might become when I stopped defining myself by someone else's limitations and started honoring my own strength. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I was having coffee with Janet when she brought up Brian for the first time in months. We'd maintained our friendship through the difficult transition period, and she'd been invaluable in helping me rebuild my professional network and personal confidence. "I heard he got married again," she said casually, stirring sugar into her latte. "Some woman he met at the hardware store where he was working. Apparently she has 2 kids from a previous marriage and doesn't mind that he's starting over at 45. I felt a brief flicker of something, not jealousy exactly, but curiosity about whether Brian had learned anything from our marriage's collapse. Had he become more appreciative, more respectful, more aware of partnership dynamics? Or had he simply found someone with lower expectations, someone who didn't know what he was capable of when he felt secure and entitled? "Good for him," I said, and meant it. "Everyone deserves a second chance to get things right." Janet studied my face carefully. "You're really okay with this? No residual feelings about him moving on?" I considered the question honestly. The Brian who'd spit on me outside the naval base felt like a character from someone else's story now, someone I'd known peripherally rather than intimately. The anger I'd carried for months after our confrontation had faded into something more like anthropological interest, curiosity about human behavior rather than personal investment in outcomes. "I hope he's learned something," I said finally. "I hope he treats her better than he treated me. But mostly, I'm grateful that whatever he's learned or not learned isn't my responsibility anymore." My own life had evolved in directions I couldn't have imagined during those years of managing Brian's career and reputation. I'd returned to school, earning a master's degree in nonprofit administration that had led to a job with a veterans services organization. The work was demanding but meaningful, and I was good at it, good in ways that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's ambitions. I'd also started dating, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as I remembered what it felt like to be valued for my own qualities rather than my willingness to remain invisible. The men I met now knew me as an independent professional with my own interests and achievements, not as someone's supportive wife whose identity was entirely derivative. "You seem different," Janet said, echoing something several people had mentioned over the past year. "More yourself, if that makes sense. More present." It did make sense. For years, I'd been living my life at one remove, experiencing everything through the filter of how it might affect Brian's career or reputation. I'd been so focused on managing his image that I'd forgotten I had my own image to develop, my own goals to pursue, my own relationships to nurture. The divorce had forced me to rediscover who I was when I wasn't defining myself by someone else's needs and limitations. The process had been difficult, lonely at times, frightening when I'd realized how much of my identity had been tied to my role as a military wife, but ultimately liberating in ways I was still discovering. That afternoon, walking through the downtown area where I now worked, I passed the naval base where Brian and I had lived for 3 years. The sight of the main gate triggered a brief memory of that March morning when everything had changed, the argument in the car, the spit on my face, his family's approving laughter. But the memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. The woman who'd sat in that car, absorbing humiliation and planning how to minimize the incident's impact on her husband's career, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that dignity isn't negotiable, that respect isn't optional, and that partnership requires actual partnership rather than one person's consistent sacrifice for another's benefit. I'd learned that choosing yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is disappearing entirely. I'd learned that holding people accountable for their behavior isn't vindictive when you do it honestly and proportionally. I'd learned that ending something toxic isn't failure when staying would require accepting treatment you don't deserve. Most importantly, I'd learned that being nothing without someone was only true if you chose to make it true. Brian had been wrong about what I was capable of, wrong about what I was worth, wrong about what I would tolerate indefinitely. His mistake had been assuming that his view of me was the only one that mattered, that his needs were automatically more important than mine, that his career gave him license to treat me however he wanted. The real irony was that in trying to diminish me, he'd forced me to discover just how substantial I actually was. In spitting on me, he'd freed me from any obligation to protect him from consequences. In calling me nothing, he'd motivated me to prove exactly how much something I could be when I stopped accepting his definition of my worth. Walking away from that base for what I knew would be the last time, I felt something I'd never experienced during my marriage: complete peace with my choices, complete confidence in my worth, and complete ownership of my own future. It had taken years to reach this point, but the journey had been worth every difficult step. The woman who'd once believed her husband's success was more important than her own dignity was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most important relationship you can have is the one with yourself, and that no partnership is worth preserving if it requires you to become less than who you really are. 3 years after that final walk past the naval base, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar: Brian's brother, David, whom I hadn't spoken to since the divorce proceedings. "I hope you don't mind me calling," he said, his voice uncertain. "I got your number from Janet. I wanted to talk to you about Brian." My first instinct was to decline politely and end the call. The chapter of my life that included Brian and his family was closed, and I had no interest in reopening it. But something in David's tone made me pause, not the entitled demand I remembered from family gatherings, but something that sounded almost like humility. "What about Brian?" I asked. "He's in the hospital," David said. "Heart attack. He's stable now, but it was touch and go for a while. The doctors say stress was a major factor." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but the dull ache of old sympathy. Despite everything that had happened between us, Brian and I had shared 10 years of marriage, countless memories, genuine affection before it all went wrong. Hearing that he was suffering didn't bring me satisfaction, just a tired kind of sadness. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "Is there something specific you wanted to tell me?" David was quiet for a moment. "He's been asking for you. Not constantly, but when he was conscious after the surgery, your name was one of the first things he said. The doctors think he might not make it through the next few days, and I thought maybe you'd want to know." I thanked David for calling and promised to think about what he'd told me. After hanging up, I sat in my office overlooking the city park where I often walked during lunch breaks, trying to sort through the complicated emotions his news had triggered. Did I want to see Brian again? Did I owe him that much after everything? Was visiting him an act of compassion or a form of self-torture? Would seeing him weak and vulnerable satisfy some lingering need for vindication, or would it just reopen wounds I'd worked hard to heal? That evening, I called Janet to talk through my confusion. She listened patiently as I worked through my conflicted feelings, offering occasional questions, but mostly just letting me process out loud. "You don't owe him anything," she said finally. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't go if part of you wants to. Sometimes closure comes from unexpected places. What if seeing him just brings back all the anger?" I asked. "What if I realize I'm not as healed as I thought I was?" "Then you'll deal with that too," Janet said. "You're not the same person you were when you left him. You're stronger now, more sure of yourself. Whatever happens, you can handle it." The next morning, I drove to the hospital. The cardiac intensive care unit was quiet and sterile, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the hushed conversations of worried families. Brian was in room 314, according to the nurse who directed me down a long hallway lined with identical doors. I stood outside his room for several minutes, gathering courage. Through the small window, I could see him lying in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. He was awake, staring at the ceiling with the unfocused expression of someone heavily medicated. When I finally knocked and entered, he turned his head toward the door with obvious effort. His eyes widened when he saw me, and for a moment he looked like the young officer I'd fallen in love with 20 years earlier, vulnerable, hopeful, uncertain. "You came," he said, his voice raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "David called me," I said, taking the chair beside his bed. "He said you'd been asking for me." Brian nodded slowly. "I wasn't sure you would. Come, I mean. I know I don't have any right to expect it." We sat in silence for a while, both of us navigating the strange territory of this reunion. The man in the hospital bed was undeniably the same person who'd spit on me outside the naval base, but he was also somehow different, diminished not just by illness, but by what looked like genuine reflection. "I've had a lot of time to think," Brian said finally. "About what happened between us, about the choices I made, about who I was during our marriage. The doctors say stress contributed to this heart attack, and I know most of that stress came from trying to rebuild my life after losing everything I thought mattered." He paused, breathing carefully. "But lying here, thinking I might not make it, I realized that what I lost wasn't really everything. It was just the things I thought defined me. The real loss was you, not because you left, but because of why you left. Because of who I became and how I treated you." I listened without responding, unsure whether this was genuine insight or the kind of deathbed clarity that might evaporate if he recovered fully. But something in his expression suggested this wasn't a performance. He looked exhausted by the weight of his own recognition, worn down by finally seeing himself clearly. "I know it's too late for apologies," he continued. "I know saying sorry doesn't undo the damage. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I put you through, what I threw away, what I lost when I lost your respect." "What made the difference?" I asked. "What made you finally see it?" Brian smiled ruefully. "My new wife left me 6 months ago. Different reasons than yours, but the same pattern. I was doing it again, taking credit for her work, dismissing her contributions, treating her like she existed to support my recovery rather than as a person with her own needs and goals. The irony was striking, but I felt no satisfaction hearing it. If anything, I felt sad that it had taken another failed relationship for Brian to recognize patterns that had been obvious to everyone except him. "She told me something before she left that stuck with me," Brian said. "She said I was like a black hole. I took in everything around me, all the support and effort and love, but I never gave anything back. I just consumed it and expected more." He looked directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. "You tried to tell me that for years, didn't you? In subtle ways, in conversations I dismissed, in looks I ignored. You tried to show me what I was doing wrong, but I was too arrogant to listen." I thought about those years of careful attempts to address our growing imbalance, the gentle suggestions that had been brushed aside, the direct conversations that had been reframed as nagging or neediness. Brian was right. I had tried to fix things, tried to restore some equity to our partnership. But I'd also enabled the dysfunction by continuing to provide support even when it wasn't reciprocated or appreciated. "We both made mistakes," I said. "I should have insisted on better treatment instead of hoping you'd recognize the problem on your own. I should have set boundaries instead of waiting for you to respect limits I never clearly established." Brian shook his head weakly. "Don't do that. Don't take responsibility for my behavior. That's something else I've learned. I spent years blaming other people for my problems, making my failures everyone else's fault. You weren't responsible for making me treat you better. I was responsible for recognizing how lucky I was to have your support and respecting it accordingly." We talked for another hour, covering ground we'd never successfully navigated during our marriage. Brian asked about my work, my new life, my hopes for the future. I told him about the nonprofit, about returning to school, about discovering interests and capabilities I'd forgotten I had. He listened with what seemed like genuine curiosity and pride, as if he was finally seeing me as a complete person rather than an extension of his own needs. When visiting hours ended, I stood to leave. Brian reached for my hand, carefully, asking permission with his eyes before making contact. "Thank you for coming," he said. "And thank you for leaving when you did. I know that sounds strange, but if you hadn't forced me to face consequences, I might never have learned anything. I might have kept treating people badly indefinitely." I squeezed his hand gently. "I hope you recover completely." I hope you use whatever time you have left to build better relationships, to treat people the way they deserve to be treated. I hope so too, Brian said. And I hope you know that everything good that's happened in your life since we divorced, you earned that. You are always capable of amazing things. I just made it hard for you to see it. Driving home from the hospital, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Not closure, exactly, but a sense of completion that had been missing despite my successful rebuilding efforts. Seeing Brian acknowledge his mistakes and take responsibility for his behavior didn't change our history, but it validated my decision to leave and confirmed that growth was possible even for people who'd seemed incapable of self-reflection. Brian did recover, though it took months of rehabilitation and lifestyle changes. We didn't maintain contact, but through mutual acquaintances I heard that he'd taken early retirement from his hardware store job and started volunteering with veterans organizations. He'd apparently become someone who listened more than he talked, who asked questions about other people's experiences rather than dominating conversations with his own stories. Whether this transformation was permanent or temporary, I couldn't say. People can change, but they can also revert to old patterns when circumstances allow it. What mattered was that Brian had finally seen himself clearly enough to acknowledge the damage he'd caused, and I'd been strong enough to hear his acknowledgement without needing it to define my worth or validate my choices. The woman who'd sat in that hospital chair, listening with compassion but without dependence, was someone I'd never been during our marriage. She was someone who could extend forgiveness without forgetting boundaries, who could offer understanding without accepting responsibility for someone else's failures, who could feel sympathy without losing sight of her own needs and priorities. That hospital visit became the true end of my marriage to Brian, not the legal divorce or the geographical separation, but the moment when I could see him as a flawed human being struggling with his own limitations rather than as the source of my problems or the measure of my worth. In finally taking responsibility for his behavior, he'd freed me from any lingering sense that I should have tried harder, done more, been more patient or understanding or forgiving. I left that hospital knowing with absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice in leaving, that I'd built a better life than anything I could have achieved by staying, and that the woman who'd once defined herself through someone else's success had become someone worth knowing in her own right. That was the moment I realized I was never nothing without him. I was more than enough on my own. Have you ever had someone try to tear you down after you gave them everything? How did you handle it? Would you have stayed silent like I did that day, or spoken up on the spot? Drop your story in the comments. I want to hear from you. And if you believe respect isn't optional in any relationship, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth.